the AMMACH Project.
The AMMACH Project welcomes Cathi Morgan, who gave a tremendous presentation at the first AMMACH Conference in 2012. How, Cathi, did we get to that stage? And you are, of course, the first Ammach Witness to be interviewed in a long series of Ammach Witness testimonies. So tell us how we got here from there.
Right. Well, I contacted Ammach via Miles, via yourself, after seeing some of the basis interviews, because I'd always felt that my life was unusual, and after seeing people talking about having some sort of anomalous intervention in their lives, I began to work on the premise, research on the premise that that might have happened to me. And as soon as I began to research my life, it turned up thousands and thousands of strange facts. That,
I mean, this is fascinating what you've been doing.
It seemed to form a picture, even though I didn't have memories. My memory of my life was very, very fragmented, and with lots and lots of blank areas. So when I put all the facts together, I became convinced that I was really onto something. So I was interviewed by yourself in 2011, in which I discussed some of these events, and then I did a year's research, so my presentation was the results of that research.
So what initially are you? What did you find out about yourself? I mean, you talked about twins and twins research, but let's get back to really who you are. Who is Cathi? If you can do that.
Gosh, that's quite a difficult question. Well, I'm somebody who doesn't really seem to have anything in common with anybody else around me in my life. So finding Ammach was very valuable, because I feel like I've found other people who are like me, who don't relate to not only to society's values as a whole, which many people don't, but to the way that other people live their lives, and what their the activities that they do. I've never really fitted into that.
What is involved with your presentation today?
Right. Well, in order to uncover unusual events in my childhood, I interviewed my parents, and I also researched the area that we were living in a little bit more depth. Now, my parents, my mother mentioned, I asked if there was anything unusual. She mentioned that we had family, there was a connection with a lady Moran, and so I went on to research her and found out she worked at Porton Down. And
now, Porton Down is the important research facility in Wiltshire.
Yes, it's where there was testing done on military personnel using LSD in the 50s, and it's been used obviously for testing on humans. So that was an interesting fact there. So I went into more depth with the initial facts that also the area, the village of Swainswick, where we were moved to for 7 years, is just 3 miles from Rudloe Manor, where there's a verified underground utility, and this is where the supercomputers are housed. Because although the base was kept quite hush-hush, in 2011, in a local council meeting in Coombe Down, it was put on record that the 3 bases in Bath were going to be moved, and 1,100 personnel had already been moved, and 1,400 were going to move over the next 2 years.
Now, which 3 bases?
Well, that will be MD Foxhill, Rudloe Manor, and there's another one, I don't know, because I've only just kind of come across this information, but they said that, oh yeah, that's it, the computers at the Ensley site wouldn't be able to be moved because of the type of computer that was there. They couldn't move them.
Why were they moving?
I don't know where they're moving, and I don't know why they're moving. It was a council meeting, and then it was reported in the local paper because they were really talking about the jobs that would be, you know, going out of the area. So apparently the computers there are used for this. This is on the internet. Was used for the Skynet. They're used for the Skynet program. It said.
The Skynet program is what's that? Is some kind of.
Well, I don't know. It just said this.
I suspect John Lear may have mentioned something about Skynet, but we'd have to maybe pass that on for a deeper time.
In other words, they are. It's an important area.
Yeah.
In that
sense.
So,
what exactly did you find? I mean, in your initial interview, you really did reveal a tremendous amount about mind control in the United Kingdom. Can you add to that?
Well, that's what I wanted to look at, because I'd learnt about mind control through the MK Ultra program, but all the details were about the United States, and the only thing I'd really seen about military mind control was the only person talking about it was really James Caswell and Barry King, and I wanted to know more. I thought, well, such a lot's come out about MK Ultra, and it's been officially documented in the Senate hearing in the late 70s. But what about the UK? There's nothing. Nobody seems to be asking about the UK.
Well, in Timothy Good's book, everything seems to be happening everywhere else in the world, and nothing's happening here. Move on. There's nothing going on here. Move on.
Absolutely. I think that's because it's been particularly effective here.
And that's because you are beginning to uncover that Britain is one of the biggest places for mind control.
Well, my own personal opinion is that it's been done extremely effectively, and we're virtually one huge mind control experiment in actual fact. But to get to the bottom of it, to get to the facts that can demonstrate that is another thing. I mean, we can all speculate, and that can just be easily dismissed. Anyway, I did manage to start finding links between the conferences that were being attended by MK Ultra doctors and practitioners, and people in the UK attending the same conferences, and also people in the UK who went from the UK to the United States and became involved in the MK Ultra programs. I found documentation about LSD units, experimentation, and even there's been compensation for many people who've sought compensation for these experiments, these LSD experiments in the UK.
Any project names or locations?
There was a unit at a hospital called Potwell Hospital. There was a hospital in Chelsea. Birmingham University was involved. I do bring this into my presentation, and I'm going to follow up the presentation with more detailed facts online. I'll put those online in the coming weeks. So
this was your first presentation, is it?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And you met some people as you came to Manchester. Could you tell us about that?
I came from Manchester to... Oh, right, yeah. Yeah,
at the
I
Nottingham
came from
railway
Manchester
station
to Nottingham, and the first person I met when I got off the train, I looked around to ask for directions to the hotel, and I got talking to a chap outside a hairdresser's. Shall I mention the name of it? No, I better not. Actually, it might be inundated. I asked him the directions, and I happened to mention, because we got talking, that I was doing this presentation on mind control, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, mind control." He said, "Yeah, this is why you've met me." And so he went into some detail about his interests, and he said, "I know all about Project Oak Tree." And
so can you tell us about that?
I know very little about Project Oak Tree. All I know is that Barry King mentioned Project Oak Tree related to a mind control program for people of my age, so people born around 1958, 1960, and it was called Project Oak Tree, and I could find nothing else on it on the internet whatsoever. So because I looked, and then I met this chap outside on the way to the conference who said, I know all about Project Oak Tree, and his father was in MI6, and obviously I was only talking to him for a short while. I didn't get a great deal of information.
Well, tell us what you did get.
Well, he said it was to do with the well, really, that's all he said. I need to follow it up and find out what he does know. All he said was he knew about Project Oak Tree. But later on, he contacted me. We were in communication a few days later, and he told me I mean, I'm quite fact-based, so this is a bit out of my normal kind of subject area. But as you bring him up, this, the fact that I met this chap, I'm just describing what he communicated to me, and he's the chap who knew about Project Oak Tree. He says he knows about Project Oak Tree, so that needs following up.
So in a couple of words, what would you describe yourself as, and why are you giving this presentation?
I'm giving the presentation to further established facts on mind control and manipulation of people unwittingly. I want to document that this does happen, so that people who might be somewhat confused as to what the heck's going on, and who don't fit into the normal lifestyle, who've got a wider consciousness, sometimes they feel quite confused and not sure why. So I want to put the facts on the table. Well, this has happened to people, this has happened. You can extrapolate that other experimentation is happening at whatever level, whether it's simply through basically television programming, social engineering, or something even more intense than that. I just want to get the facts out there. In the UK, this has happened.
And you mentioned about social programming. What about this thing in schools? Just before we commence your presentation, UFO alien pods in schools. Well, what's involved there? Well,
I happened to visit my grandchildren, my daughter and my grandchildren, and asked them what they did at school today. And they said, "Oh, Nana, an alien pod landed in our school." Is this just made up? I don't mean you made up, but do you think the teachers made it up for the children to see as a game?
No, I don't.
Or do you think it really was real?
It was real. No.
Were there any police vehicles there?
Yeah, that's police.
How many?
2, and then the girl went home because the boy kept talking about it.
And I thought, what?
And this is Rochdale?
This is in Rochdale. So I got my mobile phone out and recorded them, and I asked them, tell me about it, what happened? They went on to describe arriving at school. They were kept outside the school. 2 police cars were there. Police officers, men in forensic, in the full white suits with hoods. There was a pod, perhaps it was about 2 feet in diameter, a circular pod, and or perhaps a little bit bigger, half embedded into the ground, covered by a canvas. And they were told that they can't go in the school yet because they weren't sure if it was safe to go past this pod, and that the scientists, the people in white suits were scientists. They were taking readings to see if it was okay. They were eventually let into the school, and where they were told that pods had landed at other schools as well. Now, I said to them, is this really real? Do you think this is really real? Or was it something that the teacher made up as a game? And they said, no, it was really real. They really believed it. But when they said another school had pods, I got onto the internet and found a whole list of primary schools that had this same exercise. So they were deceiving the children, they were shocking them. by having these official figures and deceiving them, and the teacher was also not telling them the truth. So a large number of primary schools, the children have been led to believe that an alien pod has landed and that there are aliens. Are absolutely, you know, these role models, teachers, police officers are confirming for them, yes, aliens exist.
And how many police and scientists were involved with this?
There were 2 police cars and 2 policemen in uniform and 2 in the white suits, 2 figures in these white forensic suits at the school that my grandchildren went to. So my what I thought was, is this, you know, because we all, well, not everyone, but many people have heard of Project Bluebeam, which basically says that that in order to bring in a one world government, they need an external threat to unite people, and there was talk of a Project Bluebeam where people would be made to believe that there was a UFO threat, perhaps through a hologramic spaceship and so on. Now this is quite old, but obviously too many people know about it. That's not going to work. But are they doing a similar project on the school children, on all the future citizens of the UK? Are they implanting in them the that UFOs are real in order to do a similar manoeuvre? I don't know.
Well, thank you very much, Cathi. We'll lead to your presentation and enjoy this excellent presentation you've done for the first AMMACH conference, and thank you.
Thank you, Miles.
Hi folks, just for the tape, I'm just going to reintroduce Cathi Morgan, just because we've had a tape change, so excuse us for that. So I want you to welcome Cathi Morgan, whose talk is going to be about mind control in the UK, and it's a very personal perspective. Just ask you again, thank you very much, Cathi. Let's put our hands together.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'm presenting my research from a personal perspective. However, I will just go over, I'm sure you're all familiar with MKUltra and the way that mind control has been documented to have taken place, but I'll just briefly go mention about that for anyone who doesn't. So basically, nobody can say that it doesn't exist because MKUltra did expose the existence of mind control programs, and it was fully documented that these had occurred. The report of the Senate committee in 1977 made that quite clear, and that is in fact online. If you just go to the wiki about MKUltra, you can get links to the documentation, to this document, and to the actual CIA declassified documents as well. So that makes interesting reading. So as many of us know, it was research that involved murder of tens of thousands and torture of tens of thousands of human participants, and it involved drugs, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, electric shock. So we're looking here at such things as psychotronic weapons, the development of implants, drug and hypnosis, and so on. So what were some of the drugs that they were trying to develop and test? Well, the interesting thing is that when people come forward to say that they've experienced mind control, and there are apparently very few of them in the UK, the ones that do come forward sometimes are accused of being inconsistent, and they may even be rejected for that reason. But however, when you look at the substances that they were developing, it becomes clear that they were actually trying to... Louder? Sorry.
talk a little bit closer to the mic?
Okay, they were obviously trying to ensure that people undergoing these experiments were not able to talk about them, both by bringing about amnesia, confusion, and so on. They were researching drugs that would specifically do these things, and they also told the police that if somebody came to them or was picked up talking about being interfered with by doctors, that they were to go to specific hospitals. They were to be taken to specific hospitals. Now, so when people do come forward, it's important that we have that we don't have a hostile climate for them. And if they are talking, and AMMACH really has provided a platform for people to talk about things very freely, which is absolutely wonderful. Now, we know from the declassified documentations that the mind control experiments took place in universities, medical centres, which were co-opted and infiltrated. We know that happened in the USA. I'm looking at what happened in the UK as much as I've been able to find out. Now, it's known that the Macy Foundation was a funding conduit for used for the CIA to channel funds to the operants. And so I've been particularly looking at who was working under Macy funding in the UK and who was attending the same conferences as the people in America. In fact, it appears that there was a massive social engineering program. For example, the CIA purchased 20 million doses of LSD from the Sandoz laboratories and then contracted Eli Lilly in Indiana for a more reliable source that they could order tens more million. In fact, the quote that I saw said, by the tonnage, and we're talking LSD by the tonnage, hundreds of millions of doses. And these were distributed freely, as well as being used in the programs. They were thrown over, for example, bundles would be thrown over the walls of campuses to be discovered by the students. Now, when you do start researching this, it does become absolutely clear. There's no question that that there's an Illuminati New World Order that is being rolled out, and some researchers, wonderful researchers, have documented this meticulously. David Icke in the UK, Alex Jones has done some great stuff on this, Alan Watt in Canada, and Dr. John Coleman, who, with his work about Tavistock and the Committee of 300, go into it in great detail. But unquestioningly, Fritz Springmeier, work on the Illuminati too is wonderful. It's clear, though, that the majority of people are not aware of this now, because it's not taught in schools, it's not talked about in the mainstream media, and there's been no expense spared to develop distractions of entertainment, sport and fashion, and to manipulate the populations. The well-documented routes are shrouded in obscurity of distraction, basically. So here are just a few examples of the kind of organisations so that mind control was perpetrated through the research of of course, organisations like the Skull and Bones and Cecil Rhodes Roundtables. The planning was done through the World Federation of Mental Health, the World Health Organization, non-government organisations and think tanks, we've got the funding there. These are just a few brief examples of the way that it was perpetrated. So it shows that manipulation actually goes right to the heart of our medical establishments, our educational establishments, our governmental establishments, which makes it almost unthinkable when you talk to people with no background of actually scratching the surface on these things. It just seems totally unbelievable. But as many of us know, the documentation is there. Now, the interesting thing is how did many of these psychiatrists, doctors, and so on come to be involved in mind manipulation? Because some of them were doing it unwittingly, and some of them were doing it wittingly. And I believe that it's just a question of when you want to get ahead in your career. You may think that you're helping people and you're doing good research, but this research is being appropriated for the New World Order agenda. And it's just a question of small compromises, like a eugenic approach to the public and to the masses not being the same as us. And I think we have to all be really careful when we make compromises in order to get through our day-to-day life and as to who we work for and what attitudes we're prepared to adopt, because I think it's all these small compromises at every level that allows for this mind manipulation to take place ultimately. And that's all we can do, basically. I know we do have to do those compromises, but get in and get out as fast as you can. That's what I think is the only thing that can be done about it. Now, this research is about my own personal experiences, and yes, and I believe that I came to believe that my family had been subjected to some sort of research interference, experimentation, probably to help spread the Tavistock agenda of promoting promiscuity and new age and destructive feminist programming to dissolve the strengths of families and stable religious values. And because they like to do it on twins, because they like to gauge the progress of the agenda that's being rolled out, and they can work with one twin and compare the other twin. So my own twin there, I'm the one on the right showing my knickers there. And my other twin had a completely stable life. She got married once and she lived in 2 houses in her life, and whereas I've lived in probably 40 or 50 different places and had a very chaotic life. So I talked to my parents about this. When I started to become aware of the mind manipulation that was taking place, I had lots of alarm bells going off that something of this nature had happened to me. And I decided to interview my parents, or talk to my parents. And as I was interviewing them, I realised that I wasn't getting all the information, so I started videoing them. I videoed interviews of several hours, probably about 8 hours of video, asking them questions, so that I have actually got their testimony on video as to what they spoke to me about. Now, one of the things that my mum said, I said, is there anything you can remember that was unusual about my upbringing? And she said, well, my mum kept saying that there was a connection with Lady Moran. And that was the interview where I went into the other room and she followed me out and said, be careful who you're talking to, we don't want you disappearing. And I was a bit shocked at that, but I didn't know who Lady Moran was, but I did check it out and found out she was a scientist at Porton Down who worked in World War I with poisonous gases. She got an MBE at the age of 24 and actually spent a year in a coma in St Thomas's Hospital for a year before marrying Charles McMorran Wilson, who became Lord Moran, or Churchill's doctor, as he's better known. Now, one of the more well-known MK Ultra type of psychiatrists in England is William Sargent, because he had a sleep room at St Thomas's in 1947, and he corresponded with Ewan Cameron, who was proven to have been researching mind manipulation techniques for the CIA, and Sargent was doing very, very similar, virtually the same type of therapy in his sleep room at St Thomas's Hospital. Now, Lord Moran was his tutor and mentor and gave him financial and moral support, and it was he who suggested that Sargent go into psychiatry because he did his initial dissertation on pernicious anemia. Now, we do find that at that time when psychiatry was developing, there was a lot of crossover between the subject areas. So people who were studying the blood, for example, like Sargent, then went into psychiatry. People who were studying electronic models of the mind were then performing psychosurgery. So the parameters of psychiatry were just being created in those first decades of the 20th century, and people were moving from discipline to discipline very much. That's very much a feature of what was going on. Now, Dorothy Dufton got a grant at the age of 22 from the Royal Society, an Illuminati organisation, to study poisonous gases. And she was a pupil of Sir Joseph Barcroft, who was an expert in fetal development and intergenerational science. Her father actually also studied gases. He was called Felix Dufton, and he patented something called a fractional gas separator, which enabled gas to be separated from matter. And he patented it. It's called the Dufton tube. So it was in the family. So I wondered where the connection with my family was. I've been trying to find out. Now, her father actually became a school inspector in Leeds when he retired from being a scientist. So that's one possibility. And the other possibility is my great-grandfather made a great deal of money supplying horses to the military in World War I. We had a large house, Grandma had a large house with servants, and the second phone in the town. So he was Irish, and he apparently, I've been told recently, there were IRA connections, but for whatever reason he did fall out of favour. He ended up a pauper and a broken man, so we didn't retain the wealth. It's always the way, isn't it? So Joseph Barcroft, Dorothy Dufton became an assistant to Joseph Barcroft after she'd been his pupil, and he was the head of the physiological department at Porton Down. She helped co-author the 1918 and 1919 reports of the Porton Down Chemical Warfare Committee. Barcroft worked at Porton Down in World War I, and he remained in contact between the wars, and then he was called back during World War II to work there, and then he went on to carry on with his research into fetal development. He was interested in finding mediums in which fetuses could be delivered to gestate, to grow, which has got interesting implications. That's why Porton Down would be interested to have him as the head of the physiological department, with his background and expertise in fetal development and intergenerational sciences. He was also studying, this is what I mean about the crossover between subjects that was going on at the time. He also led an expedition to Tibet to study altitude sickness, and we know that that is something that some of the Nazi scientists were also very interested in, altitude sickness, and how people perform at high altitudes. Obviously, when they're developing aircraft and they're going higher and higher, this needs to be taken into consideration. So another pupil of Joseph Barcroft was William Gray Walter. Now, he worked on radar, as Churchill said here, and he also wrote books about synthetic hypnotism with his wife, here who's pictured. Now, he worked in Bristol for many years, and he was connected with the Macy Foundation. He was an attendee at the Macy cybernetic conferences. So there we have our link to MK Ultra and William Gray Walter. he discovered the delta and theta rhythms. He created the first electrodes for deep implantation in the brain, and he determined the flicker rate that televisions that would best induce a hypnotic state. So he was working on these things at the Burden Institute. His speciality was recording brain waves, the machine that records brain waves, that notates them. And he was working at a place called the Burden Neurological Institute in Bristol. So eugenic roots, the Burden Neurological Institute was... The Burdens were a missionary couple, and they used to run the Stoke Park mental colony, which housed up to 1,750 patients. Now, they proposed a plan to test the entire population at the age of 11, and those that were under par would go into a massive national mental colony, and this is in 1939, and they would be a cheap source of labour. Now the plan was moderated, and they instead donated the money to open Burden Neurological Institute. However, in 1947, 85,000 children born in 1936 were tested, took an intelligence test at the age of 11 in the Scottish Mental Survey. There were many tests going on, sponsored by the Eugenics Society, and they were administrated from the London School of Economics. Now, the first leucotomies that took place, or lobotomies as they're called in America, took place at the Burden Neurological Institute, and a couple of nearby hospitals offered up their patients as guinea pigs. Frederick Goller was the director, and he was persuaded by William Sargent to carry them out because London County Council had refused him permission. So one poor chap, there were 5 patients operated on, one poor chap had only been in hospital 4 days because he'd broken down after the bombing raids in Bristol, and had been diagnosed neurotic, and he'd only been in hospital 4 days. There's many horror stories about leucotomies, but the interesting thing is it was that Sargent's involvement there right at the beginning, I think. And Gray Walter was also present at the first use of electric shock treatment in Britain in 1940. Despite the fact that he was known as a cyberneticist, he was also dabbling in neurosurgery. He was building machines with functions replicating human functions that could be conditioned, basically. That was his area of speciality. And in 1977, they were still doing research at the BNI, and this is the thing about the attitude of the doctors towards the public. It's not quite. They're not quite on the. They don't consider themselves quite on a par. For example, some patients had sent home with 2 34-way sockets in their heads. Now, this isn't a picture of that. This is just quite an evocative image I managed to find. But they'd be sent home with these 2 34-way sockets in their heads, and this chap, Ray Cooper, who was director of the Burden Neurological Institute in 1977, actually said they can carry on as normal, they can live normal lives because they can just have a piece of gauze over the sockets and wear a head covering. And that's their view of what the public, that would be a normal life for the public. They wouldn't think of that as a normal life for themselves. Of course, here's the eugenic attitude. They've just had that little shift to a eugenic attitude towards the public. So, William Gray Walter, there were new breakthroughs happening in the effectiveness of applying cybernetics to psychology, which led to psychiatry becoming an established discipline, and as soon as William Gray Walter identified this, that when people, you will have heard of this probably, I think it's called something like the negative contingent variant, and so that when you're going to make a decision to do something, say I'm going to pick up that glass of water, the impulse would have shown on a graph if I was wired up before I even realised I was going to do it. So, for example, William Gray Walter was the first person to observe this. So we'd have people looking at slides, and they were given a button to press when they wanted the slide to change, but they were wired up, and it was the brain impulse that was changing the slides. The button was a dummy button, and they were complaining that they were changing too quickly before they were ready, but they were changing on the impulse, on the brain impulse that was being recorded. So when this was discovered, the eugenicists just loved it, because this was the kind of thing that they loved to hear, that the masses are just nothing more than a complex but predictable combination of chemicals and electronic impulses. And so around this time, they called... the World Health Organization organized some conferences to discuss the psychobiological development of the child, so they could apply this insight that they gained through the mechanical and electronic insight into how the brain worked, could be applied to psychology and psychiatry and the population. So William Gray Walter, as I said, he was a neurophysicist, but he was invited along with people such as Frank Fremont Smith, chairman of the Macy Foundation, Margaret Mead, also associated with Tavistock, John Bowlby, Tavistock psychiatrist again, Eric Twist, who actually described William Gray Walter as his best friend in his autobiography. And so, yeah, William Gray Walter's there in Bristol in 1953-54, saying child refugees again, another eugenic statement, really, his view of the refugees being horrible creatures. And interestingly, from my point of view, it's rather difficult to get children who've been through a traumatic psychological experience and arrange to observe them long enough and carefully enough. Now, this is interesting to me because I've read that in Fritz Springmeier that the Illuminati were particularly interested in children from Catholic backgrounds because they're more ripe for experimentation, because they have already been traumatized to some extent in many cases, or they're veering towards that being that way. Because as a Catholic, I was brought up as a Catholic, and I was moved down to very close to Bristol, in actual fact, about 10 miles away from Bristol at the age of 4. So we know that the Macy Foundation was used as a front for the CIA to filter money through to the academic establishments, the medical community. Now, some of the topics that were discussed at the Macy conferences, which have been documented, as I say, to be the attendees at the Macy conferences, the Macy cybernetic conferences, were the psychiatrists that were documented to have worked on MK Ultra projects. So they were discussing child psychology, analog versus digital approaches to psychological models, formal modelling applied to the chicken pecking order formation, and memory, and there was an appeal for collaboration between physics and psychology. And many of the attendees went on to do extensive government-funded research on the psychological effects of LSD as a potential tool for interrogation in the CIA's MKUltra program. The Macy Foundation also sponsored a series of gestational conferences considering fetal studies, and Barcroft's son attended these and went on to research LSD, again, fetal development LSD, you know, the way that they crossed over from subject to subject was incredible, really. So some of the Macy attendees there, Abramson was known to have given LSD to the chairman of the Macy Foundation, Frank Fremont Smith, And from the UK, William Ross Ashby. We've got John von Neumann there. He was a mathematician. Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. Norbert Weiner, the cyberneticist. So in the UK, the cyberneticists were, they created their own group called the Ratio Club, and it was invitation only. I think it was based at Cambridge, and some of the attendees were involved in wartime signals interpretation at Bletchley Park. We've got there some of the members meeting with Norbert Weiner, and I'd just like to just read a little quote here about who McCulloch was, because he was also intimately involved in MKUltra. So Andrei Puharich studied the effects of radio waves on animals in Northwestern University in the 1940s, and later founded a laboratory he called the Round Table Foundation of Electrobiology. His associate in the organisation was Warren S. McCulloch of Bellevue, an early advocate of electronic brain implants and chair of conferences sponsored by Joshua Macy Jr. Foundation. Puharich was later employed in the Army's Chemical and Biological Warfare Center at Fort Detrick, Maryland, researching the effects of LSD for the CIA in 1954. He perfected the radio tooth implant, a small little relay and receiver and transmitter. Puharich also worked at the Permanent Research Foundation and was funded by Sandoz Chemical Work. I've got a quote here, and I think it's from Jim Keith, another researcher, and he says, English anthropologist Gregory Bateson had a lifelong commitment to reprogram humanity. Bateson's British and American intelligence-sponsored takeover of the nascent field of cybernetics in the 1950s from its creator, Norbert Weiner, led directly to Bateson's LSD-driven experiments on schizophrenia and creativity in Palo Alto, which in turn were the origins of Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters and the house band The Grateful Dead. So you see the connections between the cyberneticists and the Merry Pranksters, the Grateful Dead, etc. So in England, we had Ross Ashby, who invented something that was called the homeostat machine, considered to be the nearest thing to a human brain. They built these models so they could understand programming, and then they applied it to psychology, basically. And interestingly, when a couple of weeks before he developed the homeostat machine, he seemed to have some strange symptoms. This is a quote from his journal, and about the strange condition he found himself in. And considering how the CIA were dropping LSD in each other's drinks, and there's so much of it about at the time, it just makes you wonder when you see a quote like that. Now, we do know that there were physicians working in the UK with LSD experimentation. Ronald Sanderson, Thomas Ling, John Bookman, John Elks, and Joel Elks, who's known for certain to have been one of the primary covert contractors in CIA's MKUltra, advising Porton Down and thus MI6 on the interrogation possibilities of LSD. So what happened was there was... I've just lost my figures here. I've got a few statistics that go with this. Ronald Sanderson's initial research was conducted on a small scale until a friend stepped in. This friend was Professor Joel Elks, head of the Department of Experimental Psychiatry at the University of Birmingham, at the time advising Porton Down. He encourages Sanderson's work with LSD and arranged for a £50,000 grant from the Regional Hospital Board. Now, considering that in 1972, a three-bedroom suburban house with a garden and a view cost £2,800, £50,000 in the 1950s can be put into perspective. And Lobster magazine, where I got this quote from, asked, was the local health board really that enlightened, or was this money coming from government-sponsored research, basically, from intelligence services? So Joel Elks then went to work at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Washington and was very much part of the MK-Ultra experiments. One of his co-authors, who was called Bradley, was also working on LSD. They were working on they experimented on humans, but they liked to do it on cats as well, because then they could chemically analyse the brains afterwards. It was very distressing. So just to get onto my own background now. If I asked myself if I was part of an experiment, which I've come to feel that I am. As I said, I have got no retrieved memories, and I haven't attempted to recover them yet, and I'm going to, but I wanted to research the background first to see if there was, was it just something I thought, or was there any solid evidence there for it? Now, I was part of the National Child Development Surveys, which were carried out in 1946, 1958 and 1970 at 12-year intervals. They were studying a group of children who were all born in 1 week in a particular year. So I was born on the 8th of March, and anybody, say, between the 6th of March and the 13th of March would be part of this survey. So that's 17,000 children in the 1958 survey. Now, I've been doing a bit of research into the National Child Development Surveys, and I found out that the initial one in 1946 was funded by the Eugenics Society and the Nuffield Foundation. The one in 1958 was funded by the National Birthday Trust Fund, which was an organisation ostensibly to help fewer women die in childbirth, but it becomes clear that, again, it's another one of these charitable organisations that seem to be doing good, but when you look a bit closer, you find out that they're actually supporting the New World Order agenda. And for example, one of the people closely associated with the National Birthday Trust Fund was Lucy Baldwin, wife of the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who was a member of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. They did supposedly help working class women, but there's an account of how they invited 50 of them to one of their big do's, and they weren't allowed to eat at the main table, and so on. So it really wasn't as nice as they pretended to be, basically. Now, I've looked at the documentation of the National Child Development Survey, and there's nowhere in it does it say that the children will be visited like we were every 3 months by a doctor who made an 80-mile round trip to come and see us. It actually said that they only managed to get the funding for an initial survey of the parents at birth, and then in 1965 there was the first follow-up. So there's nothing whatsoever about the attention that we got. I asked my parents, I just happened to say to them, well, when was the last time you saw this doctor? I said, always the same doctor. 2003. 2003, he visited them because we were monitored up to the age of 4 when we moved down to Bath, and then we came back to Rochdale at the age of 12, and then he continued to visit them. So I was wondering if that's where we might have been picked up. So we moved to Bath in Somerset, which is as I say, only about 10 miles from the Burden Neurological Institute, but it was also a very Masonic city. There's a big spring there that gives forth 1 million litres of hot water a day. So so you can imagine, the Romans thought this was wonderful. They built this wonderful baths here, and there's all Masonic kind of architecture and Masonic symbols everywhere. And the Freemason architects of Bath actually asked to be buried in the village that we were moved to, which was in Swainswick, just outside Bath. When we moved to the village of Swainswick, there were only 270 residents there at the time, and the entire village is still owned by Oxford College, Oriel College, Oxford, where Cecil Rhodes established his Rhodes Scholarships. Now, Lower Swainswick, where I lived, was basically just a load of mansions, probably about 8 mansions, and the grounds, and some cottages where the workers to these mansions worked. Now, just before we moved there in 1962, they built 2 roads in the grounds of one of these mansions called the Elms, and there were just 10 houses on my street and about 20 houses in the next street. So that's all that was there. So there were only 270 residents in the whole of Swainswick. In Lower Swainswick, there was just these 2 new roads. Everyone that lived on my street was working for the armed forces, for the Admiralty. And I've discovered that we were 3.6 miles from Rudloe Manor. So Rudloe Manor it's built on a huge network of quarries and tunnels, which 250,000 square metres of which this is what they've admitted to, is being used as underground storage and facilities. They don't go into any detail. So it's well known amongst UFO researchers because it is where it was a coordination point for dealing with reports of UFO sightings. And the Skynet system, the Skynet computer system, is also housed in that vicinity because there's another big base, MOD Fox Hill, 3 miles away from our house too. It's the house we were living in. Now this is quite interesting. They kept it fairly quiet because a chap on the BBC World War II website was trying to find out what his father did there after the war, and he rang them in 2005, and he was told, oh no, the base shut after the war and all the records are destroyed. Now that in fact was not the case, because in 2011 the local council, Coombe Down, it was reported in the local newspaper that 1,200 staff from the Bath area are in the process of being transferred, and another 1,400 are scheduled to follow in the next 2 years. The closure of all sites would end the MOD's 72-year association with Bath, having had offices in the city since the start of the Second World War. However, not all of the Ensley site can be disposed of because the computer systems cannot be moved. So presumably that's the Skynet system. Right, so one of the mansions that was very close to our house in Swainswick was called the Elms, and just in 1939 a couple lived there called McVicar, and the maiden name of his wife was called Wallace, Alice Wallace, and she died in 1939, so he built a park there in memory of his wife. Now, I happened to find out that, the Wallaces made their money at the same Kimberley diamond mines as Cecil Rhodes. Now, they had a big house in Essex, and they also had a house in South Africa, both called Greystones, and there's quite a well-known movie made about Greystones, and this is her family, Alice Wallace's family. The park was called Alice Park, and it was frequently visited by Queen Mary, and also Agatha Christie, as it happens, I just noticed. But the Queen Mother has also been pictured there planting fruit trees. Now, after ceremoniously planting fruit trees, after his wife died, he built the park, and he started these children's clubs for the local village children to do sports, etc. That's McVicar. Now, oddly enough, my family have got links with Queen Mary because my grandfather's mother worked for the dressmakers to Queen Mary, and Queen Mary's dresses were fitted on my great-grandmother. And my grandfather's father worked for Phillips the jewellers to the royal household too. So another coincidence really that we will move to this area where it's associated with so there's a big Illuminati connections there. The guy who designed the pavilion in Alice Park was George Jellicoe, and he was godson of King George. Now he was also a member of the Honourable Knights of the Round Table and the Other Club, which was founded by Winston Churchill to advance the interests of the leading aristocratic and Illuminati families in the UK. He was also twice director of S.G. Warburg Finance and Development. So there's the pavilion there that he designed in Alice Park. Now, he was also known to have worked alongside Guy Burgess and Kim Philby in the Foreign Office during the Cold War. Now, my mother told me that somebody involved in the Cambridge 5 scandal lived in Elm Grove, the next road to us. And I said, oh, who, Mum, who? I can't remember now, she said, but my mother became godmother. He lived with his mother and his grandmother, and the grandmother converted to Catholicism while we were there, and my mother was asked to stand as godmother. So I'm still working on, let's try and go to remember which one. I'm like, well, which one? So that was in Elm Grove, one of the other street in Swainswick. Now, the house for the provost of Oxford University was just at the bottom of our road, about 200 yards from our house. And interestingly, Lord Byron, now we used to live in a council house in Rochdale before we moved to Bath in Somerset, and Lord Byron is very much associated with Rochdale, and he used to visit the Eden Hall there. So when we went there, of course, we went to the Catholic school in the centre of the city, and the headmistress there was called Sister Ignatius Loyola, which is a very unusual name to choose. So it does imply, obviously, Ignatius Loyola was the head of the Jesuits, the founder of the Jesuits, and some say the Jesuits actually, that Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Illuminati. So the Jesuits are what's known as the Black Popes. They're the military wing of the Vatican. And so my headmistress had called herself after the Illuminati founder. Yeah. And so what struck me was there were lots of twins in my class. This is one of the little things that started this research, was that there was 3 sets of twins in my class, and there were about another boy in my class these just all moved to the area at the same time that we did, and a boy in my class had twin sisters too, and they moved away back to their own respective places that they come from when we were 12. So the other thing that was a bit of a shock to find out was that my mother, when I was interviewing her, said that she was one of twins herself. Oh no, what she said was, oh, your grandma used to say that I was a twin as well. So I'm like, what? You're a twin? What? Well, where's the other twin? She said, oh, well, my mum used to say that the other twin was crying in the corner of the room, and then they took it away. Now, a priest attended the birth, a Catholic priest, and a midwife, and my mum's circumstances are very congruent to being a twin, because she only weighed 3 pounds, but she was fully formed, and she lived at home. She was born at home, she stayed at home, she survived perfectly well. Now, if she'd have been premature and 3 pounds, she would have needed intensive care, so that does seem to bear out what she said. Now, I do believe that my mum was... now, Frank's... Actually, I'll just tell you what Fritz Springsmeyer says about twins. It's very interesting. He says, When one twin disappears, the surviving twin will often develop psychological problems around the disappearance, even if the child is never told that they had a twin. The Illuminati believe that the soul of a dead twin goes into the live twin. They consider twins, which have two souls, to be very powerful individuals. So they think that the other twin attaches itself astrally to the surviving twin. Now, my own twin sister, oddly enough, I've just found out as well that her husband has been working under the Official Secrets Act for the last 20 years. He was taken out into the car and he was asked if he wanted to do... He's some kind of engineer. I've only just found this out, actually. And asked if he wanted to do this work. He was working for British Aerospace, and he said, yeah. And they said, oh, yeah, we've vetted your family and they're all okay. Because I was speaking to him about my father-in-law, and I said, oh, do you know who he is? Because my ex-father-in-law was the head of RTE, which is the equivalent to the BBC in England. It's the radio television air, and he was the first head of the news department there. And he was the person who decided how the news would be presented to the Irish public. Now, in his obituary, it said that he boasted about blowing up power stations in the UK, and he was also interned in the UK for some time. So I said to Chris, I said, well, do you know who my father-in-law was? And he goes, oh, yeah. I said, well, do you know what he did? He goes, oh, yeah, I know who he did. He says, but they still let me, they still said it was all right. They checked out my family background and I was fine to do this work. And he says my brothers are working up in developing weapons up in, I think he said up in Newcastle, did he say? Somewhere up there. He said, and they're going to be ready in 2025. He says, but I don't think I should be telling you that. So that's what he said. But it was just a bit of a surprise to find out. I thought that none of our family had any military connections whatsoever. So to suddenly find these connections is a bit weird. Now, Fritz Springmeier says that to ensure that programming and he says this about Catholics, to ensure that the programming and abuse stays hidden from even the slave is given a daily dose of trauma as it keeps the child disassociative. One of the Illuminati's fronts is the Catholic Church, which the Jesuits manage for the Illuminati. And he goes on to say how many Catholic clergymen have been involved in creating the trauma network, creating trauma-based mind control slaves. Now, the point I was going to make with this picture here is that my mother, as it says there, the droopy left arm, my mother actually did have a droopy eye as well, which she always said was because she was hit with a snowball as a child. But I just wondered, because I do feel that my grandfather and my mother were actually handlers and that they were programmed. That's how I feel about it, and that's what when I do go into bringing up some memories, because I haven't done any regression or anything to look into memories, but I will. That's what I'll be expecting to find out. Now, I was doing my family tree recently, and I was contacted by somebody on there, and she said, "Oh, I'm related to you." She said, "My grandmother was your granddad's sister, and she was taken away to be educated at the age of 4 by an auntie and another woman called Mary Thomas." I don't know who this Mary Thomas was. However, she went to university in the 50s when women didn't very often do that. She had a son, and her son was a mathematical genius to some extent. He got a scholarship to Cambridge at the age of 17, and when he did his PhD, he went straight into the Royal Air Establishment. She sent me this newspaper clipping about him where it says that he was considered by colleagues to have a brilliant mind. He went straight into the RAE as a defence research scientist, working on the design of Concorde. He helped organise the Defence Research Agency when it split from the RAE when the RAE was dismantled and Thatcher rearranged it all and the Defence Research Agency was formed, he was there helping her to do that. He organised the Farnborough Air Shows. Internationally, his participation in specific programmes involving collaboration within NATO took him to France, Germany and the US, into the Pentagon. He was in London at the time of the Gulf War and also took a chair in the Commonwealth Collaboration Conference in Australia. So his daughter, who contacted me, she said, oh, what do you do? Oh, well, very boring. I work for an American defence company. I've been there all my life, you know. Right. Why am I not surprised, you know? So she also said when he died, she looked through his papers, found he was learning to speak Russian. So anyway, some of the family background that I've mentioned up to now has come through her because we've been collaborating on trying to find out what our ancestors, what do you call them, our family, what they did and so on. Now, what I found is that, excuse me, is that my mum is very dismissive of what her mum used to say. So my grandmother was trying to tell us that something was happening. She's the one who kept saying, there's a connection with Lady Moran. There's a connection with Queen Mary, the dressmakers and so on. Now, she wasn't... I'd just look at her and think, Grandma, I'm not impressed. I'm not a royalist. You know, I never took any of it in. I thought, oh, be quiet, you silly little lady, you know. And if I could invite anyone to dinner, as they say from history, it would be Grandma, to find out what it was she was trying to tell us. She wasn't talking about her own family. She wasn't going, oh, we're connected, you know, aren't we great? She was saying, your granddad, it was my granddad's family she was telling me about. And I've tried impressing my mum, but my mum is really dismissive. Oh, she said Lady Moran, I don't know what she was on about. Oh, yeah, well, she said I was a twin, you know. She's got this dismissive attitude, and in that I hear my granddad. Now, my granddad would have been going, oh, silly woman, what are you talking about? Be quiet. And my mum was the apple of my granddad's eye. So when he was in the Home Guard, he took my mum with him, and he took her and showed her these charts that show what aircraft, the shapes of the aircraft, and she had to learn all those by heart, and that her and Grandad were like that, and Grandma was kind of ignored and dismissed. And she's actually, I've got this picture here which shows the lady that was taken away at the age of 4, my Grandad's sister, there on the far left, and my grandmother is third from the left, in the middle there. And the other two are my granddad's other sisters with one of their husbands there. So it was my grandma who's really remembering things that she said has really helped me to put this jigsaw together. Right, so how are we doing for time? I'll just check. Okay, so when we were living in Bath, one of the mansions in Swanswick behind us, about 200-300 yards away, was on Ensley Lane. If you remember, the base was called the Ensley base, where the computers are being housed, the Skynet computers. And on Ensley Lane was Balebrook Lunatic Asylum. Now, what's kind of interesting about Balebrook is that in 1895, the medical director was called Emery Lamphere, and he was the founder of the American Medical Association. There were two people that founded it, Emery Lamphere and Oman Doomsnil. So in Bath, in Balebrook, in Swanswick, it was that kind of place, you know, it was the elite kind of Illuminati kind of place, basically, and there he was, the founder of the American Medical Association. Now, he was, in 1895, he was already doing boring holes into the skulls of patients, or trepanning as it was known, and he used to lecture on the operant treatment of idiocy. In fact, Bath is where the first, it's very much associated with the care of patients, mental patients. It goes way, way back to the in actual to the 10-something actually, and in the 1600s one of the first institutions was there, and so on. Anyway, what is interesting though about Balebrook is that the guy that was medical director there when we were there, he was medical director of Balebrook, and he was also head of child psychological services throughout the whole of Bath. And he is actually well known for something completely different. He's known as somebody who felt that he was part of a soul group reincarnation of the Cathis. And he's written many books on this, and he was interested in the Cathis. He was very interested in the Cathis, but he was a scientifically minded chap. That was he wasn't interested in the paranormal in any way until he was approached by a lady who said that she'd been dreaming about him, and she felt that he was a reincarnation of one of the Cathis. Now, I didn't know what the Cathis were. I went and looked them up. They were a sect of the Catholic Church who wanted to do away with the middlemen. They didn't want the priests. They were nomads, and they'd go from place to place, and they were vegetarians, and they didn't have any rules or regulations to impose on people, but they were just very easygoing kind of breakaway from the Catholic Church, and they were decimated. They were massacred in the Inquisition in France in, I think, around the 1500s. So that was the Cathis, and Gurdon was very, very interested in the Cathis. So I think that he was, after reading his autobiography, it sounds like he was being used as an experimentee in a psychotronic experimentation, because he would hear this high-pitched noise, and then he'd feel dizzy, and then he'd hear these communications. Now, I'm electrosensitive, so when I'm around wireless equipment, I hear a high-pitched noise. I know when he was describing it, I thought that just sounds like that noise that I hear when people are getting texts and like, you know, I'm electrosensitive, so I know that that's what it was. And there's been an investigation done into his case by which I read about in the Psi Pioneer magazine, which concluded that this Miss Mills, who was feeding him information, who's pictured there in black, she was probably a fraud, because 5 people rang him up to say that they were her family, and apparently they all sounded just the same as Miss Mills. And interestingly enough, one of his children that he was seeing in his professional capacity was also drawing pictures of Cathis and writing these obscure names of Cathis on their painting. Now, because it was such an obscure subject, he was getting these dreams and hearing these communications, he was willing to believe that he was part of a soul group of Cathis that were reincarnated in Bath at the time. And I think that some of the people that were interested in this soul group that were actually visiting France, there, a site where the Cathis were massacred. But I think that he was a scientific man, and they wanted to see if they could change somebody's frame of mind from being, which is what MK Ultra documents said, that they were experimenting and trying to change people to the complete opposite of what they were originally. So just interesting that he happened to be around there when my sister and I were living there. We moved back to Bath, from Bath at the age of 12, or just before we were 12. Now, I actually ran away from home when I was in Bath at the age of 6, because I felt something was dreadfully wrong. Initially, where our garden was, we had a big Victorian greenhouse full of grapes, because even though we had this new little house that had been built, it was built on the site of this mansion, so there's this massive big greenhouse. And I got all the local kids I could get into the greenhouse, and I was trying to form a resistance group, because I felt that there was something terribly wrong. And quite shortly after that, they didn't take much notice, they just giggled at me, and I couldn't really communicate what I was trying to say. So I actually ran away at the age of 6, hoping to permanently make my home elsewhere. And then I also tried to run away at the age of 9, but ended up walking miles and then coming back, realising there was nowhere to go. And then eventually at the age of 15, I ran away from home permanently. And I ended up working in as a runaway under a false name. I was sent to the Athenaeum Club, working in Pall Mall, and actually serving members of Parliament their tea and scones up in the reading rooms. I was actually living at the top, the very, very top there. We had a balcony, and that's in Pall Mall. And so this is another question I've had: is was I sent in to infiltrate, put in positions where that was possible? Because another lady that was associated with my family was Lady Morrison, who was a best friend of my auntie, who went on to marry Lord Morrison, the Prime Minister, the Socialist Prime Minister, who became a film censor. And there they are with Bob Hope, who's actually been named by many Illuminati mind control slaves, as it happens. Now, the strange thing is about Lady Morrison is that she, after Lord Morrison, the socialist, apparently, died, she went and joined up with, as a council member, a very right-wing group. And this right-wing group of people involved people working for MI6 and MI5, and they were generally considered to be the ones that brought Mrs. Thatcher into power. One of the people on the council, she was on the council, her name's on this book, she helped co-write this manifesto by the association, National Association for Freedom, NAV. So, which is just funny. But she's there on the front of the book now. The other people who on the council were really interesting. They include Robert Moss, who wrote speeches for Mrs. Thatcher, and is currently actually lecturing. He worked for MI6 and MI5, and he's actually lecturing on dream research at the Esalen Institute at the moment. How people can have joint dreams and can go into each other's dreams and so on. But what struck me as being odd was the fact that these were all by no means socialists whatsoever. They were involved in a right-wing coup, basically, to try and bring Thatcher into power, because the other people involved were involved with the infiltration of subversive groups, such as the people who were running unions and the pop festivals and so on. So interesting, because I felt that I was possibly part of maybe a program to infiltrate into the home of the head of the RTE News, and possibly I was put in the Athenaeum Club too. I could have easily dropped LSD into any of those guys' drinks and food. And strangely enough, Harold Wilson was convinced that people, that MI5 and MI6, that there was a plot against him by the intelligence services. So that was just trying to run briefly through. Oh yeah, and there's Niall, who I was married to, through that later part of my life. So we're just getting to the end of the time here, and I wondered if we've got a bit of time left, Joanne, if anyone's got any questions, or have I completely blasted you with too many facts? Nope. Right. Well, what my next step is going to be is to obviously I feel that I have established some very convincing and compelling evidence. Basically, the sheer volume of it, and every time I've looked into something, it's just giving up more and more. So I think it's a good basis to proceed with some regression and to try and uncover some actual memories in that way, because I just wanted to stay grounded and get the facts first of all before proceeding. I didn't want to think, oh ding, that's happened to me, and then wander off to a regressive therapist, and who knows, that might mean that you just manufacture sort of fantasies. So I've done this research as a basis to establish the possibility that something did happen, and now that I do have that basis, my next step will be to go for some help with getting memories back. So thank you very much for being so receptive, and that's great. great, thanks.
This one on? No? I'll speak to Cathi. I just wanted to ask Cathi, actually, how your whole experience has impacted you on your health and wellness and your ability to be functional in life.
It's impacted me greatly, actually. I've always been terribly, terribly isolated, and I've never had a peer group. I think they can do this when you've got a twin, actually. So I think I was actually separated from my twin psychically as well as physically all the way through my life. And my mother was we were very much conditioned, you know. We toilet trained at the age of 6 months, and we were made to recite pieces, long pieces of perform, you know, and behavioural measures. We were really conditioned. It's quite hard to explain, really. It's been strange, actually, because I've had it's very difficult for me to have done this looking at my life, because I've got very little recollection of my life as a kind of whole, and it's very fragmented. So it's impacted me very, very much. Yeah.
Well, I have to say, folks, you know, we're all coming from such different points in our lives, and we've all had different things. But, you know, I think in this field with the mind control and these issues, and the people who have, like Chantal's experiences, and everybody else here, we all have our own. But these things, you know, when people are so isolated, you know, we just need to be more supportive. We need to be more open-minded, and we need to really give absolute kudos to people like Cathi for coming forward for probably the first time publicly with her research about her own personal life. And I know it may not all have been easy to take in, but this is the beginning for us. And, you know, I've said before that the material that Ammach will come across may not be easy listening. We never promised that. We just promised to tell the truth, or the truth on behalf of others, or to bring in people to tell their own truth, and to give them a safe platform in which to do that. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, and thank you, Cathi. Please give her a warm welcome. Thanks. Okay, guess what? It's muffin and coffee and tea time. Yay. I'm going to do the raffle at the end of, you know, as we come back for the next speaker, who's going to be Mike Oram. And so if you want to come back, bring your tea and coffee in here, I mean, after about 10 or 15 minutes.
Our initial interview, you really did reveal a tremendous amount about mind control in the United Kingdom. Can you add to that?
Well, that's what I wanted to look at, because I'd learned about mind control through the MK Ultra program, but all the details were about the United States, and the only thing I'd really seen about military mind control was the only person talking about it was really James Caswell and Barry King, and I wanted to know more. I thought, well, such a lot's come out about MK Ultra, and it's been officially documented in the Senate hearing in the late 70s. But what's about the UK? There's nothing. Nobody seems to be asking about the UK.
Well, in Timothy Good's book, everything seems to be happening everywhere else in the world, and nothing's happening here. Move on. There's nothing going on here. Move on.
Absolutely. I think that's because it's been particularly effective here.
And that's because you are beginning to uncover that Britain is one of the biggest places for mind control.
Well, my own personal opinion is that it's been done extremely effectively, and we're virtually one huge mind control experiment in actual fact. But to get to the bottom of it, to get to the facts that can demonstrate that is another thing. I mean, we can all speculate, and that can just be easily dismissed. Anyway, I did manage to start finding links between the conferences that were being attended by MK Ultra doctors and practitioners, and people in the UK attending the same conferences, and also people in the UK who went from the UK to the United States and became involved in the MK Ultra programs. I found documentation about LSD units, experimentation, and even there's been compensation for many people who've sought compensation for these experiments, these LSD experiments in the UK.
Any project names or locations?
There was a unit at a hospital called Potwell Hospital. There was a hospital in Chelsea. Birmingham University was involved. I do bring this into my presentation, and I'm going to follow up the presentation with more detailed facts online. I'll put those online in the coming weeks.
So this was your first presentation, is it?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And you met some people as you came to Manchester. Could you tell us about that?
I came from Manchester to, sometimes they feel quite confused and not sure why. So I want to put the facts on the table. Well, this has happened to people, this has happened. You can extrapolate that other experimentation is happening at whatever level, whether it's simply through basically television programming, social engineering, or something even more intense than that. I just want to get the facts out there. In the UK, this has happened. You know.
And you mentioned about social programming. What about this thing in schools? Just before we commence your presentation, UFO alien pods in schools. Well, what's involved there?
Well, I happened to visit my grandchildren, my daughter and my grandchildren, and asked them what they did at school today. And they said, "Oh, Nana, an alien pod landed in our school." Is this just made up? I don't mean you made up, but do you think the teachers made it up for the children to see as a game?
No, I don't.
Or do you think it really was real?
It was real. No.
Were there any police vehicles there?
Yeah, that's police.
How many?
2, and then the girl went home because the boy kept talking about it.
And I thought, what?
And this is Rochdale?
This is in Rochdale. So I got my mobile phone out and recorded them, and I asked them, tell me about it, what happened? They went on to describe arriving at school. They were kept outside the school. 2 police cars were there. Police officers, men in forensic, in the full white suits with hoods. There was a pod, perhaps it was about 2 feet in diameter, a circular pod, and or perhaps a little bit bigger, half embedded into the ground, covered by a canvas. And they were told that they can't go in the school yet because they weren't sure if it was safe to go past this pod, and that the scientists, the people in white suits were scientists. They were taking readings to see if it was okay. They were eventually let into the school, and where they were told that pods had landed at other schools as well. Now I said to them, is this really real? Do you think this is really real? Or was it something that the teacher made up as a game? And they said, no, it was really real. They really believed it. But when they said another school had pods, I got onto the internet and found a whole list of primary schools that had this same exercise. So they were deceiving the children, they were shocking them by having these cover unusual events. In my childhood, I interviewed my parents, and I also researched the area that we were living in a little bit more depth. Now, my parents, my mother mentioned, I asked if there was anything unusual. She mentioned that we had family, there was a connection with a lady Moran, and so I went on to research her and found out she worked at Porton Down. And
now, Porton Down is the important research facility in Wiltshire?
Yes, it's where there was testing done on military personnel using LSD in the 50s, and it's been used obviously for testing on humans. So that was an interesting fact there. So I went into more depth with the initial facts that also the area, the village of Swainswick, where we were moved to for 7 years, is just 3 miles from ReUpload Manor, where there's a verified underground utility, and this is where the supercomputers are housed. Because although the base was kept quite hush-hush, in 2011, in a local council meeting in Coombe Down, it was put on record that the 3 bases in Bath were going to be moved, and 1,100 personnel had already been moved, and 1,400 were going to move over the next 2 years.
Now, which 3 bases?
Well, that will be MD Foxhill, ReUpload Manor, and there's another one, I don't know, because I've only just kind of come across this information, but they said that, oh yeah, that's it, the computers at the Ensley site wouldn't be able to be moved because of the type of computer that was there. They couldn't move them.
Why were they moving?
I don't know where they're moving, and I don't know why they're moving. It was a council meeting, and then it was reported in the local paper because they were really talking about the jobs that would be, you know, going out of the area. So apparently the computers there are used for this. This is on the internet. Was used for the Skynet. They're used for the Skynet program. It said.
The Skynet program is what's that? Is some kind of.
Well, I don't know. It just said this.
I suspect John Lear may have mentioned something about Skynet, but we'd have to maybe pass that on for a deeper time.
In other words, they are. It's an important area.
Yeah.
In that
so,
sense.
What exactly did you find? I mean, in your.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, I
Nottingham
came from
railway
Manchester
station
to Nottingham, and the first person I met when I got off the train, I looked around to ask for directions to the hotel, and I got talking to a chap outside our hairdressers. Shall I mention the name of it? No, I better not. Actually, it might be inundated. I asked him the directions, and I happened to mention, because we got talking, that I was doing this presentation on mind control, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, mind control." I said, "Yeah, this is why you've met me." And so he went into some detail about his interests, and he said, "I know all about Project Oak Tree." And
so can you tell us about that?
I know very little about Project Oak Tree. All I know is that Barry King mentioned Project Oak Tree related to a mind control program for people of my age, so people born around 1958, 1960, and it was called Project Oak Tree, and I could find nothing else on it on the internet whatsoever until so because I looked, and then I met this chap outside on the way to the conference. He said, "I know all about Project Oak Tree," and his father was in MI6, and obviously I was only talking to for a short while. I didn't get a great deal of information.
Well, tell us what you did get.
Well, he said it was to do with the well, really, that's all he said. I need to follow it up and find out what he does know. All he said was he knew about Project Oak Tree, but later on he contacted me. We were in communication a few days later, and he told me I mean, I'm quite fact-based, so this is a bit out of my normal kind of subject area. But as you bring him up, this, you know, the fact that I met this chap, I'm just describing what he communicated to me, and he's the chap who knew about Project Oak Tree. He says he knows about Project Oak Tree, so that needs following up.
So in a couple of words, what would you describe yourself as, and why are you giving this presentation?
I'm giving the presentation to further established facts on mind control and manipulation of people unwittingly. I want to document that this does happen, so that people who might be somewhat confused as to what the heck's going on, and who don't fit into the normal lifestyle, who've got a wider consciousness.
The AMMACH Project.
The AMMACH Project welcomes Cathi Morgan, who gave a tremendous presentation at the first AMMACH Conference in 2012. How, Cathi, did we get to that stage? And you are, of course, the first Ammach Witness to be interviewed in a long series of Ammach Witness testimonies. So tell us how we got here from there.
Right. Well, I contacted Ammach via Miles, via yourself, after seeing some of the basis interviews, because I'd always felt that my life was unusual, and after seeing people talking about having some sort of anomalous intervention in their lives, I began to work on the premise, research on the premise that that might have happened to me. And as soon as I began to research my life, it turned up thousands and thousands of strange facts. That,
I mean, this is fascinating what you've been doing.
It seemed to form a picture, even though I didn't have memories. My memory of my life was very, very fragmented, and with lots and lots of blank areas. So when I put all the facts together, I became convinced that I was really onto something. So I was interviewed by yourself in 2011, in which I discussed some of these events, and then I did a year's research. So my presentation was the results of that research.
So what initially are you? What did you find out about yourself? I mean, you talked about twins and twins research, but let's get back to really who you are. Who is Cathi? If you can do that.
Gosh, that's quite a difficult question. Well, I'm somebody who doesn't really seem to have anything in common with anybody else around me in my life. So finding Ammach was very valuable, because I feel like I've found other people who are like me, who don't relate to not only to society's values as a whole, which many people don't, but to the way that other people live their lives, and what their the activities that they do. I've never really fitted into that.
What is involved with your presentation today?
Right. Well, in order to